never knew what it felt like to die on the spot, until the moment I accidentally called a Mafia boss the one forbidden word. Inside a packed Italian restaurant, I bent down to hand a customer their cat carrier when I bumped shoulders with a man. Without looking up, I snapped the familiar line I used to scold my ex-baby move. The man turned around. Not a customer. Not Lucas. But Adrian Valente, the Italian-American Mafia boss whose name people only dare whisper. The entire restaurant froze. His men put their hands on their guns. I stood there, petrified, face smeared with tiramisu after stumbling into the dessert table in front of him. Adrian walked toward me. Not fast, not slow. Just enough to make my heart try to escape my chest. He tilted my chin up. "What did you just call Mafia boss Valente?" My voice died in my throat. He smirked, half-smile lethal. "Say it again. Slower." And in that exact moment, I knew I had opened the gates of hell with one word. Just one. Just. Because the man I mistakenly called baby was Adrian Valente. And I was just Emily Carter, the pet courier who always chooses the wrong person to piss off. It's hard to even describe the silence that fell over that place. It wasn't a quiet silence, you know. It was the kind of heavy, pressurized silence you get right before a storm hits, where the air itself feels like thick glass ready to shatter. The only sound was the faint drip of the chocolate sauce from my chin onto the white marble floor, and even that sounded ridiculously loud. I couldn't even look at his face, not really. I was staring at the sharp point of his tailored jacket, the expensive wool of it, and the absolute stillness of his hand resting just beside his side. His eyes, though I could feel them, they were dark, and they didn't just look at me. They absorbed me like a tiny crack in the pavement that he could just step on and erase without a second thought. I finally managed to croak out my voice, sounding weak and high-pitched like a child's. I thought you were someone else, sir. I'm so sorry, I'm just here for the pet delivery. The smell of the rich coffee and the garlic from the kitchen was suddenly cloying, making me dizzy with panic. My hands were shaking so badly I could hear the little latch on the cat carrier rattling against the handle, and the poor Siamese inside let out a tiny startled meow. That sound seemed to break the tension for maybe a half-second, but then it came roaring back when I heard the low, dangerous rumble of Adrian Valente's voice again, colder and demanding. He didn't move much, but the way he leaned in just a tiny bit was worse than if he had yelled. It made it personal, crossing that invisible boundary between the powerful and the insignificant with frightening ease. I could smell the expensive cologne he wore, something subtle and smoky like aged leather and wood, and the faint scent of the fine Italian wine they were drinking at his table, a Barolo. I recognized the bouquet from a desperate job I took cleaning high-end glassware once. He didn't take his eyes off me, not for a moment, and his thumb, firm and demanding, lifted my chin up just enough that I had to meet his gaze. All around us, the other patrons were either gaping with pure, unadulterated shock or whispering under their breath, and the humiliation was scorching me alive. I caught the eye of a woman at a nearby table. She was wearing far too many diamond stones the size of my thumbnail, and her lips curled with a mix of pity and absolute disdain, a silent, cruel verdict on my existence. She nudged the man next to her, a pale man whose face was already beaded with nervous sweat just from sitting near Adrian, and I heard her clear as a bell, though she thought she was whispering, her voice sharp and brittle. "A broke girl calling Boss Valente baby pathetic. She probably just wants attention. Look at her cheap shoes." The word broke landed hard, a perfect summary of my life, scraping by with my pet sitting and delivery jobs, just to keep my small world afloat. And it hurt worse than the tiramisu in my hair. But Adrian Valente just kept that slow, terrible smirk plastered on his face as he repeated the command, quieter this time, but somehow louder, forcing me to confront the reality of the danger. Say it again. Slower. I felt the blood drain entirely from my face, leaving my skin feeling cold and waxy. I couldn't speak. I literally couldn't push a single sound out, which, looking back, was probably the only thing that saved me from saying something truly idiotic and getting myself killed right there on the spot. My throat was constricted, dry, and tight, and my whole body was rigid with shame and terror, the absolute powerlessness washing over me. I just kept shaking my head a little, a small, desperate movement mute and pleading, trying to convey the simple truth it was a mistake. The cat carrier felt like a 50-pound weight in my hand, anchoring me to the ground, and I just wanted to drop it and disappear through the floorboards, leaving behind the evidence of my blunder. The moment stretched out forever, agonizingly, every second feeling like a physical pressure building in the room, until Adrian's thumb brushed lightly against the smudge of cream on my jawline. It was such a strange, gentle touch, given the deadly tension, a flicker of something human amidst the menace, and it caught me completely off guard. The shock of the contact was electric, momentary. He pulled his hand back slowly, deliberately examining the tiny spot of chocolate on his fingertip for a moment, before his dark eyes lifted back to mine, that same terrible, mesmerizing intensity locking onto me. His voice dropped to a level that only I could hear, a low, mesmerizing current, in the pressurized silence of the restaurant, forcing me to lean in just slightly to catch the chilling final words. "Interesting," he murmured, the smirk still there, but now, with a flicker of something new, a calculating interest that was almost as frightening as the rage, like a scientist looking at a fascinating, if troublesome, specimen. "You kept that boldness? You didn't shrink immediately. I like it." The compliment, if you could call it that, felt less like praise and more like a deeper threat. It meant he saw something worth keeping, something worth studying, something worth owning. And then, just like that, he let go of my chin, his fingers instantly smooth and cool again. He didn't offer a grand dismissal or a threat. He simply turned his back on me and walked 3 steps back toward his table, adjusting the cuff of his expensive shirt, as if nothing remarkable, nothing terrifying had happened. It was the most terrifying exit I'd ever witnessed, because it left me completely suspended, unsure if the ordeal was over, or if the true calculated punishment was still pending, a clock, ticking somewhere just out of sight. I didn't wait to find out. I grabbed the carrier, mumbled a desperate, unheard apology to the customer, who was now hiding behind a potted palm, and bolted out the front door, the feeling of every single eye in that room boring into my back, scrutinizing my retreat. I didn't stop running until I hit the next street corner, clutching my cheap canvas bag to my chest, convinced that every shadow was one of his men, coming to finish the job, to collect the debt I had just incurred with a single careless word. I know this is a heavy moment, and honestly, standing there with the taste of fear and fancy dessert in my mouth, the sheer weight of what I had done was overwhelming, completely lost and overwhelmed. But this is the thing about being overlooked, about living a small life. You have to keep moving forward even when the world tries to pin you down and tell you you're worthless. It's what keeps me going every day. It's what keeps Bella and me going, that tiny, ferocious instinct to protect what little we have. And honestly, if you're watching this right now and you feel that pressure, that tightness in your chest, when the world doesn't see you, when they judge you by your clothes or your address, know that I see you. And if you've got your phone in your hand, would you do me a small favor? Just hit that like button right now, open your phone, leave a comment below about where you're watching from, and hit subscribe to the channel. It's just a little gesture, but it's a tiny rope that keeps me tethered right here telling this story, and it means the whole world to me, truly. Now let me tell you what happened next, because that was only the beginning of the nightmare that Adrian Valente had started. I kept running, not towards home, not to the one place I should have gone, but towards the small laundromat I used, sometimes just to gather my thoughts under the harsh fluorescent lights, needing the false comfort of normalcy. I sat there for almost an hour, shaking, scrubbing the tiramisu out of my hair in the cramped, grimy bathroom, running thin paper towels under the weak stream of the tap. The shame of being mocked and the terror of accidentally insulting Adrian Valente were a potent, nauseating mix that tasted metallic on my tongue. I kept replaying the way he looked at me, that dangerous interest, and the way his men went rigid, ready to draw their weapons, the clear understanding that I was moments away from execution. I knew enough about the world, mostly through Lucas's petty, destructive orbit, and the low-level rumors he used to brag about, to understand that I had just signed my death warrant and there was no post-dated check. Nobody, especially nobody who looked like me, small, unassuming, carrying a cat carrier, got to speak to Adrian Valente that way, and walk away without consequence. I thought I might have bought myself an hour, maybe 2, to figure out how to disappear, how to shield Bella from the tidal wave I'd just created, because she, my beautiful 5-year-old reason for breathing, she was the only thing that mattered in the universe. I clutched the faded picture of her I kept folded in my wallet, the paper worn soft from years of touching. When I finally pulled myself together and rode the bus back to the alleyway where I lived, the bus brakes squealing in protest. As it turned the corner, I saw the black SUVs immediately, and a wave of ice-cold dread washed over me, a physical shock. They were too clean, too big, and too silent to belong in my neighborhood, gleaming under the single, sickly yellow streetlight, and they choked the entire alley, blocking out the last sliver of evening sun, creating their own imposing shadows. My stomach lurched, dropping like a stone through my body, and I felt that cold, immediate fear again. But this time, it wasn't just mine, it was for Bella. I knew they were there for me, and the only thing I could think was they know where Bella is. I didn't even make it past the dumpster before 2 massive shadows peeled themselves away from the vehicles and moved towards me with terrifying speed, their movements synchronized and utterly lacking in hesitation. They were wearing suits that cost more than my annual rent, but they moved with the predatory grace of trained hunters, and their faces were hard, emotionless masks. I tried to back away to drop my bag and run, but before I could even pivot, a huge hand clamped down on my arm, the grip instantly paralyzing, cutting off my circulation and my hope. I didn't scream. I just made a choked, gasping sound as they practically lifted me off the ground and shoved me roughly into the back of one of the black tanks. The polished leather seats were cool against my skin, and the door shut with a heavy, sickening thud that sealed me in a sound of absolute finality. I was trapped between 2 of Adrian's gorillas, both silent, both staring straight ahead, acting as though kidnapping a pet courier was the most mundane thing in their day, their expensive shoes polished to a mirror shine. The car started moving almost immediately, smooth and fast, tearing away from the only world I knew, leaving behind the familiar scents of garbage and cheap takeout. I tried to ask where we were going, my voice shaking so badly it was barely audible, but the words felt sticky in my throat. And when I finally managed to push out a weak, "Please, I need to get home. My daughter is waiting," one of the men just gave me a look that was utterly devoid of empathy, like I was an insect buzzing in his ear, an inconvenience that would soon be squashed. I knew then that any attempt at explanation or negotiation would be futile. They were just the executioners, and Adrian Valente was the one who had written the sentence, and it was useless to plead with the pen. The drive felt like it lasted a lifetime, and the only thing that kept me from completely dissolving was focusing on Bella, the soft, sweet scent of her hair, the sound of her innocent giggling when I chased her around our tiny living room, the memory of her asleep clutching her stuffed rabbit, everything I lived for distilled into one small, precious memory. They finally pulled up to a massive gated mansion, a towering fortress of stone and dark, heavy wood, surrounded by impeccably manicured grounds that looked like something out of a European film, an impossible fantasy compared to my reality. The gates swung open silently electronically, and the car glided up the long, winding drive, revealing a house that seemed to consume the night sky. When we stopped, the man on my left opened the door, not with a polite gesture, but with a harsh yank on my arm that pulled me stumbling out onto the gravel drive, scraping my knee. They marched me inside through a silent, cavernous entryway, with marble floors that echoed every footstep, and I felt like a sacrificial lamb being led to the altar, completely exposed and vulnerable under the weight of the mansion's wealth. They didn't take me to an office or a dungeon. They took me straight into a massive, ornate dining hall, where dozens of people were seated at a ridiculously long, polished mahogany table. Halfway through what looked like a lavish but tense dinner, the crystal sparkling under the chandeliers. The moment I was dragged in stumbling and terrified, the conversation stopped dead, the silence immediate and heavy. The atmosphere was instantly thick with cruel amusement and curiosity, every eye turning to size me up. The room was filled with men in expensive suits that made Adrian's look casual, and women who looked like they were carved out of ice, draped in diamonds and silk, their beauty sharp and unforgiving. I felt their judgment like physical blows, the pity, the mockery, the immediate understanding that I was the entertainment, the poor dumb girl who had dared to speak out of turn to the boss. I saw Adrian Valente instantly. He was sitting at the head of the table, silent, composed, watching me with that same unnerving intensity, swirling the dark liquid in his wine glass. And he hadn't moved a muscle to stop his men, or offer me any kind of protection, his inaction louder than any shout. I was held tightly by the two men in the middle of the room, a spectacle for the mobsters and their glamorous companions, my canvas bag hanging limp by my side. A woman seated near the head of the table, the same diamond-clad blonde from the restaurant, with hair like spun gold and a neckline that plunged a little too far, finally spoke, her voice dripping with venomous amusement, her eyes raking over my borrowed simple clothes. "Oh, look. The pet sitter who called the boss baby has arrived. Did you bring the cat? Perhaps we should feed her to it. Trash always knows its place." Her words hung in the air, eliciting snickers and a few low rumbling laughs from the men, the sound grating on my nerves. I tried to speak, to explain my mistake, to plead my case, to remind them I was just a courier, but the words were useless against the wall of their disdain, like throwing feathers at a stone wall. I managed to choke out, "I swear I thought he was Lucas. I had no idea who he was. I'm not a threat." But the woman cut me off with a bored, dismissive wave of her jeweled hand. "We don't care about your little excuses, sweetheart. You disrespected the Valente name in public. You made him look weak in front of his rivals. Now you pay the price for that arrogance." And Adrian, he just watched, his face unreadable, his eyes dark pools, his silence a profound betrayal, confirming everything they were saying, treating me like a trapped, insignificant insect put on display, letting the sharks circle their prey. The humiliation was overwhelming, a physical heat that turned my cheeks scarlet and made my palms sweat. I stood there dirty and scared, my cheap clothes a stark contrast to their grotesque wealth, feeling every inch the trash she had labeled me my entire life, measured and found wanting. I stopped trying to explain. I just gripped the strap of my bag tighter and met Adrian's gaze, not with anger, but with a quiet, burning challenge, a spark of defiance refusing to be extinguished. If he was going to let them humiliate me, fine, but he wouldn't break my spirit. He wouldn't see me weep or beg. After what felt like an eternity of being silently judged and openly mocked, Adrian finally lifted a single hand, raising it slowly toward the light. The room fell silent again instantly, demonstrating his terrifying authority, the absolute obedience of everyone present. He didn't speak a word to me. He just gave a barely perceptible nod to the two men holding me, who then hauled me out of the dining hall and down a long, winding corridor that smelled faintly of lemon polish and expensive wood, the air thick with the remnants of my shame. They eventually deposited me in a small, windowless room, more of a luxurious closet than a cell furnished with deep crimson velvet, and slammed the heavy oak door shut, plunging me into a silence that was almost as deafening as the noise of the dining hall, forcing me to confront my fear alone. I sat on the edge of the small velvet bench, my heart still hammering against my ribs, waiting for what felt like hours for the door to open and the inevitable confrontation to begin. The silence was absolute, the kind of silence that amplifies every nervous gulp and the frantic drumming of my pulse. I didn't cry. I was far too wired for tears, just running through 100 impossible scenarios in my head, trying to find a way back to Bella, my sole focus and motivation. I kept thinking about Lucas, the toxic ex who had used me, betrayed me, and ultimately put me in this impossible situation by training me to use that casual, intimate address whenever I needed to scold him for his constant, irresponsible screw-ups. I hated him for it. Hated him for being such a cheap imitation of a man that I'd mistakenly called him baby in front of a terrifying crime boss. The air in the room was thick and stale, the velvet scratchy against my skin, and I started pacing the small space, desperate for a distraction, for any way to relieve the mounting tension. That's when I saw the second door tucked into the corner, almost invisible in the dark paneling, perfectly camouflaged by the shadows. It wasn't locked. I hesitated for maybe 2 seconds, my internal voice screaming for caution, but my survival instinct kicked in, arguing that any move was better than sitting like bait in an expensive box. I slipped through the second door, finding myself in a labyrinth of service hallways and back corridors dark and completely silent now that the dinner was over, the faint glow of emergency lights guiding my way. I moved like a ghost, hugging the walls, my canvas sneakers making no sound on the polished floors, smelling only cleaning solvents and cold stone. I wasn't looking for an exit anymore. I was looking for a way to turn the tables any small advantage I could get, realizing that my only defense was intelligence. That's when I heard a faint distant clink, the sound of glass against glass, and I followed the noise, the faintest hope guiding me, pulling me deeper into the belly of the mansion. It led me down a winding stone staircase deep into the foundation of the house, and I realized I was in a cellar, not a dusty old one, but a meticulously organized, temperature-controlled wine cave, the air cool and crisp. Bottles were racked floor to ceiling, glowing faintly in the dim, recessed lighting, looking like expensive jewels in the dark. It smelled earthy and rich, a deep, fermented scent that spoke of age and quiet power. I had barely taken 2 steps into the aisle when a low voice cut through the silence, making me jump half out of my skin, the sound echoing off the stone walls. Looking for an escape. Emily Adrian Valente was standing a few aisles over, leaning against a stack of crates, a single bottle of dark red wine in his hand, looking entirely too relaxed for a man who had just had me kidnapped and publicly scorned. He was out of his jacket now, his white dress shirt open at the collar, the sleeves slightly rolled up to reveal the powerful forearms, and he looked less like an untouchable mob boss and more like a weary, dangerous man, taking a moment to breathe, the lamplight catching the sharp angles of his face. I froze, unable to retreat, and just stood there gripping my bag until my knuckles went white. He didn't threaten me. He just studied me. His head tilted slightly, an unnervingly calm expression on his face like a professor observing a pupil. He gestured toward a simple wooden table tucked into a corner of the cellar, 2 glasses already set out. Sit. We need to finish this conversation. No audience this time. No diamonds or drunken ex-boyfriends. I hesitated for a long moment, my eyes darting between him and the narrow hallway, knowing that fleeing would be futile. And slowly, cautiously, I made my way to the table and sat down, keeping my posture rigid, refusing to show any further sign of breaking. He poured a glass for himself, the wine, a deep ruby in the candlelight, then slid the bottle toward me, offering me the glass with a small, silent movement. I shook my head, declining the wine, needing to keep my wits about me, needing to be completely clear-headed for whatever interrogation was about to come. He didn't press the issue, just sipped his own wine, slowly watching me over the rim of the glass, until the silence became unbearable, the only sound the faint trickle of condensation down the bottle. Finally, he repeated the question that had shattered my life earlier, but this time his voice was sharp, cutting through the heavy air with an odd mix of curiosity and an almost painful inquiry. Why did you call me baby? Tell me the truth this time, the whole humiliating truth without editing the failure. I looked down at my hands, unable to meet his gaze, and the whole story just came pouring out of me, desperate, and rushed a confession of shame and necessity. I told him about Lucas, about the debts, the betrayal, the manipulative way he had always treated me, how I had caught sight of a man in a similar expensive dark suit, and simply reacted to the immediate spike of rage and familiarity, the word, a trigger, for my own bitter past. I didn't embellish. I didn't ask for pity. I just laid out the humiliating truth of my pathetic mistake, exposing my vulnerabilities. As I spoke the name Lucas, Adrian's eyes didn't just flash. They ignited with a brief, violent, palpable rage that was terrifying to witness, the kind of cold, deep fury that promises destruction, and I saw a glimpse of the true monster they whispered about. He gripped the stem of his wine glass so tightly I thought the delicate crystal would shatter under the pressure of his fingers, and his knuckles were stark white against the dark wood of the table, his control slipping for a bare moment. He said in a low, gravelly voice that sounded completely different from his usual measured tone, Lucas Grant. I know the name. A petty thief with delusions of grandeur. He's been a problem. I waited, bracing myself for him to connect me to Lucas's world, to condemn me by association, to punish me for the crimes of my ex. But he didn't. Instead, the rage seemed to bleed away, replaced by that dark, assessing quietness, and he sighed a long, deep, almost weary sound. He looked at me, really looked at me, perhaps seeing past the dirt and the fear to the desperate woman underneath the one who fought every day for survival. He leaned forward, placing his glass down with a decisive thud that echoed in the cellar, and his voice dropped to a near whisper, a tone so intimate and unsettling that it felt like a declaration, not a warning, a profound confidence shared in the silent vault. That word, baby. It's a word that hasn't been used around me in years. It belongs to a memory. A woman who meant everything. His gaze softened almost imperceptibly, a fragile crack in his impenetrable facade that revealed a vast, hidden sorrow. She saved me once years ago, when I was nothing but a stupid kid, reckless and in trouble, caught in the kind of mess that ends in a shallow grave, and she called me that baby boy. She would say like she was scolding a child. She died shortly after trying to protect a secret that wasn't even hers, and the word died with her. You brought it back, Emily. You brought back the ghost of a debt I can never repay. The confession hung between us, shocking in its vulnerability, and I realized then that my mistake wasn't just an insult. It was an accidental, profound trespass into his deepest, most guarded history, a sacred wound I had stumbled upon. He looked at me, his eyes intense, and then he delivered the chilling verdict, the line that truly changed the trajectory of my life. From the moment you called me that you're no longer outside my world, you are in it now, and the rules have changed for both of us. The weight of those words settled over me, heavy and final, like a tombstone marking the end of my quiet, simple life. I knew he wasn't talking about romance or desire. He was talking about ownership, about a consequence that transcended simple revenge. I was now irrevocably bound to a debt of memory. I was now a piece on his chessboard, an element of his past that had been resurrected and pulled into his present, and my existence was tied to his survival. I sat there paralyzed, trying to process the sheer magnitude of the truth. I was now bound to Adrian Valente, not by choice, but by a stupid, accidental word, and the ghost of a woman I never knew. The tension between us was thick and charged, a mix of my fear and his complex, unreadable obsession. But beneath it, a strange, terrifying respect had begun to bloom. I felt a surge of cold determination. If I was going to be in his world, if I was going to be a part of his life because of this terrifying twist of fate, I needed to figure out how to navigate it, how to survive, and most importantly, how to keep Bella safe from the inevitable fallout of my terrible mistake, using my brains instead of brute force. I woke up the next morning in the same small crimson velvet room, the dark, heavy door still locked, the silence still oppressive. I wasn't physically hurt, but the psychological terror and the weight of Adrian's secret confession were exhausting. I was given a tray with food, fancy pastries, fresh fruit, and strong coffee, which felt deeply strange, like being fed a last meal before an execution, the opulence clashing violently with my fear. The day passed in slow motion, punctuated only by the occasional sound of heavy, measured footsteps outside the door, the guards pacing their shifts. By evening, I was brought fresh clothes, a simple dark silk blouse and tailored trousers, something simple and dark that felt like a uniform, practical but intimidating, and told without preamble that I was expected at a private gathering downstairs. I understood instantly that this wasn't about me going free. It was about me being officially introduced, or perhaps presented to his circle, formally staking his claim. As I was led back through the mansion, I adjusted the unfamiliar fabric of the borrowed blouse, trying to find some semblance of my usual quiet dignity, reminding myself that they could strip me of my freedom and my possessions, but they couldn't take my inner strength or the moral compass that guided me. The party was in a separate wing of the mansion, a lavish, brightly lit space packed with the same sort of predatory, glittering people from the night before, only now the atmosphere was less tense, more openly celebratory, and dangerously gossipy. Adrian wasn't immediately visible, but the sheer presence of his organization was suffocating the air, thick with perfume, expensive wine, and unspoken ambition. I tried to blend into the background, clutching a glass of water, watching the scene unfold, trying to understand the delicate, ruthless rules of this new, terrifying world, observing who deferred to whom. That's when Lucas, my toxic, destructive ex, burst into the room like a cheap firework, looking desperately out of place. Despite his expensive borrowed suit, his eyes wide with a combination of drink and sheer desperation. He was shouting already, thoroughly drunk, his face flushed with a mixture of arrogance and a profound underlying terror, having somehow convinced himself that he could simply waltz into Adrian Valente's home and reclaim what he thought was his property. "Emily?" he bellowed, stumbling slightly, pushing past a sharply dressed attendant who merely raised an eyebrow. "I'm here to take my girl back. She doesn't belong with this crowd, she's mine. You can't keep her." I froze, mortified, the entire party turning instantly to stare at the pathetic scene unfolding before them, the sudden noise ripping through the polite chatter. Before I could even process what was happening, two of Adrian's massive men had Lucas pinned against the marble wall, but not before he managed to shout the most deeply humiliating thing he could possibly conjure, his voice cracking with spite and self-pity. "She's nothing. She begged me on her knees for $300 rent money just last month. She's desperate, Valente. You're taking my trash." The words echoed through the silent room, a painful public confirmation of my absolute poverty, my desperation, and the sheer grinding reality of my life outside their gilded cage. I felt all the eyes on me judging, dismissing, and I wanted the floor to swallow me whole, the heat of shame rising up my neck and face. Before the suffocating silence could break, another voice colder and sharper than Lucas's drunken shouts cut through the air like a razor blade. It was Mikhail Orlov, the infamous Russian Mafia boss, standing in the doorway with a cruel, calculating smile, his presence radiating an immediate sense of menace that eclipsed even Adrian's guards. He was a formidable man, older than Adrian, with eyes that seemed to have seen every kind of wickedness imaginable. Valente lets a broke girl call him baby, and now he lets her desperate ex scream her pathetic story in his ballroom. How shameful. The Lion of Valente is preoccupied with a charity case, I see. A pity. The way Orlov delivered the word charity was like a knife twist aimed not just at me but directly at Adrian's power and reputation, challenging his authority in front of his entire empire. I felt the atmosphere shift from cruel amusement to serious high-stakes political maneuvering, a dangerous game being played, using me as the sacrificial pawn. I was no longer just the joke. I was the flaw, the weakness that the enemies of the Valente family could exploit to bring him down. Suddenly, I was seized by Valente's men and dragged forward away from the wall and toward the center of the room, near Adrian's empty chair, positioning me like an item for auction, a prize or a liability to be examined, my fate hanging in the balance. My face was burning, my chest tight with a pain that felt physical, but I kept my back straight, refusing to crumble, refusing to give them the satisfaction of seeing my fear. I desperately searched the room for Adrian, finding him finally standing a little distance away, observing the entire spectacle with a detached, clinical air. I looked at him, pleading silently for a defense, for a denial, for something to counteract the torrent of humiliation that was drowning me, the tears finally starting to blur my vision. But Adrian Valente remained silent. His face was utterly impassive, his posture rigid, his hands clasped behind his back, seemingly unmoved by the chaos or my distress. No defense. No reaction. He just watched Lucas sputter and struggle. He just watched Orlov's cruel smile, and he just watched me, the focus of their combined scorn, standing alone in the spotlight. In that agonizing moment, watching his silence, something in me snapped. It wasn't anger. It was a profound, chilling realization that he was allowing this to happen, that he was testing me, or perhaps showcasing my insignificance, waiting to see if I would beg. My pride, my last defense, shattered inside me, leaving a core of cold, hard resolve, a furious determination to never let anyone have that power over me again. I didn't move my feet or change my posture. I just lifted my head slightly, meeting Orlov's gaze first, then Lucas's, and finally Adrian's, a silent message passing between us that I had been pushed too far. The only thing I did was slowly, deliberately adjust the small, worn canvas bag on my shoulder, the movement a silent declaration that I was done waiting for someone else to save me. I would save myself. Lucas's humiliation was the spark I needed to finally take action. I realized that the only way out of this hell was not to beg Adrian for protection, but to offer him something of greater value than my silence, something he truly needed. I knew Lucas was capable of betrayal, and his sudden drunken arrival at a high-security Mafia gathering wasn't an accident. It was a distraction, a cover for something much bigger, a leak in the Valenti armor. I had a dangerous hunch about what Lucas had done, a small detail I'd overheard him screaming into his phone about a deal that had gone wrong, mentioning Orlov's name and investments. And I knew Orlov's sudden appearance wasn't a coincidence. They were linked, and Lucas had opened the door for Orlov. The next few days were spent in a hyper-aware state of surveillance. They still held me in the mansion, but Adrian had given an order, and the men treated me with a distant, cool respect instead of open mockery, a chilling form of observation. I ate their food, I walked their meticulously manicured grounds always under watchful eyes, and I did nothing to draw attention to myself acting like a broken, resigned trophy wife. All the while, my mind was racing, trying to figure out how to get proof of Lucas's betrayal, knowing that only irrefutable evidence could grant me true freedom. I knew I couldn't just wander the mansion looking for documents, but I had one unique skill: my job as a pet courier. I had access to animals, and animals were often overlooked, dismissed as harmless accessories. I remembered a simple, tiny spy camera I had seen online, something small enough to be hidden in plain sight, something easily dismissed. The perfect spot, I realized, was a cat collar, a fluffy, utterly innocuous disguise. I contacted one of my regular customers, an eccentric, well-meaning older lady who loved gadgets, pretending I needed to borrow a prop for a client presentation involving pet tracking. I had the camera delivered to the mansion's gate with a fake delivery service hiding the transaction behind the guise of my humble profession, carefully signing for the package with a steady hand. The camera was ridiculously tiny, barely the size of my pinky nail, and I spent hours meticulously sewing it into the thick velvet lining of a cheap cat collar. My chance came during one of the nightly quiet drinks Adrian took alone in his private study, a routine I had carefully observed. I knew Lucas frequented a low-rent pool hall a few miles away, a dive bar on the wrong side of the city, desperate to find someone who would listen to his drunken rants and feed his ego. I told Adrian's security, a silent, imposing man named Marco, that I was having trouble sleeping and needed to walk the grounds to clear my head, adding a convincing sigh of despair. They, under strict orders not to bother him unless I was escaping, allowed me the relative freedom of the surrounding property. I slipped out of the side gate, calling a shady, unmarked taxi service with cash, giving a false name, and went straight to the pool hall, the collar hidden in my canvas bag. I found Lucas in a dark booth surrounded by 3 equally pathetic loud men, drunk and loudly complaining about Valenti's iron fist. I slipped the collar containing the tiny recording camera onto a flea-bitten stray tabby cat that was sleeping undisturbed under his table, making sure the lens was pointed upward and the audio receiver was clear. I didn't say a word to him. I just sat in the corner for 30 minutes, letting him rant to his pathetic crew about how he sold Valenti's worthless paper, the investment ledgers, to the Orlov network, bragging about the cash and cursing Adrian for being too smart to fall completely. The recording was shaky, smelling faintly of stale beer and desperation, but the audio was crystal clear, capturing every slurred, damning word. Lucas, in a drunken fit, openly bragged about selling Adrian's financial information, sensitive ledgers, and investment strategies to Orlov's men, intending to humiliate Adrian and make a quick fortune. He even mentioned Orlov's name and the specific details of the transaction, enough to be damning, beyond a doubt enough to start a war. I took the taxi back, retrieved the cat, giving it a generous scratch behind the ears, and the camera, and walked straight back into the mansion, holding the proof of my worth. Not in a grand declaration, but in a small, cheap plastic camera, hidden in a velvet-lined jewelry box that Adrian's maid had foolishly left open. I didn't try to find Adrian. I simply walked up to the guard outside his study and said very calmly, my voice completely steady, I need to see Mr. Valente. I have something that proves the true nature of Lucas Grant's visit and his association with Orlov. The guard hesitated for a long moment, then seeing the resolute, unshakable look in my eyes, the quiet command I now possessed, he let me pass without a word. I found Adrian sitting behind his massive desk, the glow of a single antique lamp, illuminating his face paperwork, spread out before him, and he looked up, his expression unreadable, instantly assessing the interruption. I didn't waste time with formalities or apologies. I placed the small box on his desk, opened it, and showed him the tiny camera. I told him what it contained, watching the flicker of comprehension in his dark eyes, and then I delivered my condition, the only bargaining chip I had left, the one thing I valued over my own life. I looked him straight in the eye, my voice steady, no longer shaking the humiliation of the past night, fueling my resolve and my courage. This is the truth about Lucas Grant. It proves he sold your information to Orlov's people. It proves he is the leak. Use it as you wish to protect your empire. But I have one condition before I give you this camera or the file. Adrian's eyes narrowed, his body, tensing imperceptibly, his focus absolute. He leaned back in his chair, folding his hands, the picture of lethal patience waiting for my demand, knowing it would be high. I took a deep breath, and the only thing I cared about spilled out, pure and simple. Protect Bella first. I need a guarantee of her safety, a house, a means for her to be completely invisible to your world, a life she can live without ever hearing the name Valente or Orlov, no matter what happens to me. That is my price, Adrian. Her safety. Adrian Valente froze completely, and the sheer shock of my demand was visible on his face for the first time since I met him, the surprise deepening the lines around his eyes. No one bargains with the Valente boss. No one asks for a non-monetary price, especially not a broke pet courier. He stared at me for a long moment, processing the selflessness of my demand, the absolute lack of personal gain in my request. I stood firm, waiting the silence stretching out until it hummed, until I could hear the faint sound of the clock ticking on the wall. He finally reached out, slowly picking up the little camera, examining it as if it were a strange foreign artifact that held impossible power. He looked back at me, a flicker of grudging admiration, and a deeper, more complicated respect in his dark eyes. You have grit, Emily Carter. More than half the men who sit at my table seeking only profit. You seek only protection for your child. He paused, considering the magnitude of the information and the simple, profound demand for the safety of a child. He nodded once, a sharp, decisive movement that sealed the deal with more weight than any contract. Done. Bella will be safe. You have my word. The asset will be secured tonight. Now let's see what your little toy captured and how we eliminate the threat. The information was explosive, utterly damning. The recording, when played for Adrian and his closest, most trusted men, was undeniable proof of Lucas's treachery and Orlov's direct involvement in stealing financial data, a major power move against the Valente family designed to cripple them financially. I watched as Adrian's initial skepticism turned into cold, calculating fury, his composure barely maintained. He had been looking for the leak for weeks, suspecting an inside job, and the answer had come from the very girl he had allowed to be publicly humiliated, a stroke of irony that was not lost on the men in the room. The next day, Adrian summoned an emergency meeting of his inner circle and the extended family leaders, and they met in the very dining hall where I had been paraded just days before. This time I wasn't dragged in or escorted. I walked in following closely behind Adrian, who carried himself with a terrifying composure, his presence demanding absolute silence. As soon as the room was settled, Adrian stood at the head of the table, his voice cutting through the tension with the sharpness of glass, every word carefully chosen to demolish the narrative of his weakness. He didn't mention me by name at first, just spoke about betrayal and consequences, laying out the irrefutable evidence against Lucas and the Orlov faction, the stolen ledgers, and the intercepted communications. He played the cat collar tape, letting Lucas's drunken, pathetic voice fill the opulent room, a sound of cheap desperation against the crystal and mahogany. When he finished, the silence was absolute, the men too shocked to speak. He finally turned his gaze, sweeping over his men, and then settling on me, standing quietly a few feet behind him. He took a single step closer to me, standing shoulder to shoulder, and for the first time he publicly acknowledged me not as a liability, not as a charity case, but as a crucial player whose actions had saved their empire. You all saw the weakness, didn't you? The broke girl who called me baby? The one you mocked. The one Orloff tried to use as leverage to shame me. He lowered his voice, dropping the final definitive declaration that flipped the entire narrative, sealing my fate within his world, but also granting me an unimaginable level of protection, binding them to my defense. She is not my weakness. She is my ally. She saw the truth and risked everything to deliver it. A pet courier had the intelligence and the courage to find what all of you, my highly paid trusted associates, failed to see. The room went silent, all the initial sneering and judgment replaced by a shocked, terrified respect, a sudden and profound reversal of power. I knew then that my standing in this world was no longer determined by my humble background, but by the cold, hard proof of my loyalty and my intelligence and the life I had saved. But power is never accepted without friction, especially not in the viper's nest of the Mafia, where reputation is everything. Even with Lucas publicly exposed and the Orlov faction temporarily checked, the rumors began to spread like wildfire through the underworld, twisting the truth into venomous gossip. Valente is obsessed with the baby girl, they whispered, the pet name becoming a slur. He's lost his edge, putting sentiment before safety. He's sentimental now. Adrian's own men, the ones who had to publicly respect me, still harbored deep resentment, seeing me as a dangerous distraction and a sign of their boss's supposed soft spot, a human flaw they could not abide. The Mafia Council, a group of old, cold-blooded men who governed the families with ruthless tradition, even sent a formal warning delivered with chilling gravity by an ancient stone-faced messenger: love kills bosses, fastest Valente. Get rid of the distraction before she becomes your downfall. A lion cannot wear a silk scarf. I felt the pressure not just from outside, but within the walls of the mansion itself, the silent disapproval of everyone who saw me as the living, breathing proof of Valente's human frailty, a ticking time bomb waiting to explode. The pressure began to show on Adrian too, though he'd never admit it aloud. He was distant, cooler, more withdrawn into his study, his focus absolute and unforgiving. He stopped the small, almost imperceptible touches we had developed, a hand on my shoulder as we walked through a crowded room, a fleeting brush of his knuckles against mine when he handed me a glass, the tiny moments of connection that had begun to mean everything to me. I began to wonder if the council's warning had gotten to him, if he was pulling back to protect his power, and his name sacrificing me for the sake of his empire. The coldness around him started to chip away at my fragile confidence, making me question his motives. Was I truly an ally, or just a new unique possession? He was reluctant to give up a trophy of his dominance over his rivals. The line between respect and desire blurred, and I started wondering if the connection I felt, the quiet understanding that had blossomed in the wine cellar, was nothing more than my own foolish longing for safety and belonging. I was desperate not to be just another thing he controlled, another woman who was disposable once the political usefulness wore off. The breaking point came at another high-stakes gathering, this time focused on smoothing over the tensions created by the Lucas scandal and Adrian's defense of me. It was a formal diplomatic event, a summit of sorts. Orloff, who had been lying low and nursing his defeat, executed a perfectly cruel move aimed straight at my heart, knowing Adrian's coldness had already made me vulnerable and suspicious. In the middle of the cocktail party, while Adrian was engaged in a tense conversation across the room, a large, unobtrusive screen suddenly flickered to life, interrupting the sophisticated jazz music and the polite murmuring. It was a video, grainy and poorly shot, but utterly convincing. It showed Adrian, or a man, who looked exactly like him, in a tight embrace with a stunning, statuesque woman, her gold hair bright under the lights, culminating in a long, lingering, undeniably intimate kiss. Orloff stepped forward, smiling his venomous smile, and announced loud enough for the room to hear the devastating implication. Just a reminder, Miss Carter, that the boss has many allies. Some are simply more traditional, more suitable. I stood there watching the fabricated video play out, and my heart didn't just break, It completely shattered, turning into 1,000 jagged pieces in my chest, the pain so immediate I almost dropped my glass. I knew in my gut it was fake, it had to be. The timing was too perfect, too deliberate, but the pain was real, immediate, and overwhelming, feeding off Adrian's recent emotional distance. Adrian had been so distant, so protective of his reputation, that the lie felt closer to the truth than his silence, confirming my deepest fears. I turned and fled the room, tears finally stinging my eyes, convinced that I was just a pawn in his power game, a temporary interest that was already being replaced by someone more appropriate for his world. I went straight back to my room, locking the door, packing the few belongings I had brought, my old canvas bag, the worn picture of Bella, the simple clothes I felt comfortable in, deciding in that moment that I would rather be broke and free than safe and heartbroken and constantly facing humiliation. I didn't wait for Adrian to come to me. I was done being tested, done being a symbol, done being a potential weakness. I was ready to slip away when his knock came sharp and authoritative, a command, not a request. I opened the door, my face swollen and stained with tears, my eyes burning, and I faced him with a quiet dignity I didn't know I possessed, the sight of my packed bag clearly visible. "I'm leaving," I said, my voice flat, holding my small canvas bag tightly. "Bella is safe, you kept your word, and I will keep mine. I will never speak of what I saw here or of what you confessed. But I cannot stay and be used as a political weapon or a temporary distraction." Adrian looked at my face, at the evidence of my pain, and for the first time his own composed mask cracked, showing a raw vulnerability. His hand reached out, then retracted, and he looked genuinely distressed, a raw emotion that was startling to see on his face. He didn't try to reason with me, didn't try to deny the video, he just looked at me and said simply, his voice low with regret, "You don't trust me to choose you." It wasn't a question. It was an observation, a statement of fact that cut straight to the core of the issue, acknowledging the failure of his strategy. I met his gaze, my own eyes, cold and unwavering, and I didn't mince words. "I trust the boss who keeps his word, yes. I trust your honor. But I don't trust the man who tests a woman's loyalty by allowing her to be publicly humiliated, and then lets his enemies humiliate her again with a lie just to prove he doesn't have a weakness. That is cruel, Adrian. I am not a weakness, and I am not a toy. I am a person who just saved your life and your fortune, and I need a person to care for me, not a boss to control me and force me through fire to prove my worth." I turned to walk away to make a clean break, but he stopped me, his hand finally reaching out, gripping my arm, a touch that was both demanding and unexpectedly gentle, stopping my flight. "Wait!" he commanded, his voice tight with an urgency I hadn't heard before. "You will not leave now. Not like this. Not before I correct the public narrative and silence every man who dares question my choice." He didn't explain, didn't apologize, just looked at me with an intensity that told me he wasn't asking for my permission. He was commanding me to stay for one final public act of defiance, a move so profound it would rewrite the rules of their world. The next day, Adrian didn't drag me. He escorted me, his hand a heavy possessive weight on the small of my back, to an international Mafia summit in Geneva, a gathering of the world's most powerful and ruthless individuals. The massive convention center was cold and sterile, the atmosphere thick with tension and suspicion, every conversation a veiled threat, every handshake a potential betrayal, the stakes impossibly high. I was dressed in the finest clothes they could find, a stunning dark dress that commanded attention, but I still felt like the same girl, the same pet courier, just wearing a very expensive costume that felt like armor. Adrian moved through the crowd like a king, his presence immediately shifting the energy of the room, and I was forced to walk slightly behind him, feeling the eyes of the entire underworld upon me, listening to the terrified whispers of the baby girl who was supposedly ruining the Valente boss. Midway through the main reception, where the most powerful crime families were gathered, Adrian suddenly stopped, grabbing my hand and pulling me not gently but decisively into the absolute center of the vast open floor, forcing the attention of everyone onto us. He stood there holding my hand tightly, and the entire room, hundreds of power brokers, went completely silent, watching the spectacle unfold. Adrian didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. His presence and his posture were enough. He spoke slowly, coldly, his eyes sweeping across the entire gathering, addressing the council members and the rival bosses, including a very disgruntled-looking Orloff who watched from the shadows. I heard rumors about my weakness. He stated, his voice resonating with dangerous authority, carrying across the silent hall. And I heard that the loyalty of my ally is questioned by men who rely on cheap tricks and manufactured evidence. He paused, letting the implication hang in the air, then pulled a small silver dagger from an inner pocket, the movement swift and practiced. Before I could even gasp, he sliced his own palm open, a clean, swift cut across the fleshy part of his hand, a primal act of commitment. Blood welled up instantly, rich and dark, dripping onto the pristine marble floor, a shocking interruption of the sterile environment. The action was shocking, visceral, and absolutely silent, a moment of profound, terrifying drama. He held up his bleeding hand for all to see, letting the blood drip for a heavy moment, a display of commitment that was both terrifying and utterly devoted. Then, his eyes burning with absolute focus, he looked directly at me, his gaze demanding my unwavering attention. He took my hand, the one he wasn't holding, and pressed his bloody palm against mine, rubbing his blood into my skin, forcing our blood to mingle, the raw scent of iron, filling the air, a bond being forged. He looked out at the silent room, and his voice boomed, a chilling final declaration that ended all discussion. This is not a weakness. This is my choice. Emily Carter is my chosen partner. This is my commitment. Then he spoke the words that bound us under the deepest, most archaic law of their world, an act of ancient defiance. He publicly declared Emily his recognized partner under the Valente Mafia oath, a blood vow that was older than most of the men in the room, making her untouchable. The moment the words left his lips, the entire underworld went silent, the shock palpable. No one moved, no one spoke. No one dared challenge a man who had just sealed a partnership with his own blood, giving me an untouchable status. I watched as Orlov's face finally fell, realizing that his attempts to discredit me had just made me Adrian's most sacred, most protected asset, an impossibility I was now living. Adrian looked down at me, his gaze intense, and whispered, his voice rough with intensity. No one touches a woman protected by a blood oath, Emily. You are claimed, forever, and my choice is final. The move had been terrifyingly effective, publicly cementing my place and silencing the rumors that threatened Adrian's standing, buying us time but not ending the war. The blood oath was an ironclad defense. Any attack on me would be seen as a direct attack on Adrian himself and the Valente family's honor, ensuring my safety, and by extension Bella's as long as he lived. The feeling of the drying blood on my skin was a constant, stark reminder of the depth of his commitment, a terrifying blend of violence and devotion that felt utterly real. I knew then that his earlier distance hadn't been a test of my loyalty, but a necessary cooling-off period to secure his position before he could make such a public, permanent claim, protecting me from the fallout of his own men's resentment. But the peace was short-lived because Orlov wasn't the kind of man to accept defeat, especially after such a profound public humiliation where his political games had backfired so completely. 2 weeks later, the ultimate trap was set, designed to not only kill me, but to destroy Adrian Valente's reputation and power in one single catastrophic public spectacle. It was late evening, and I was on the outskirts of the Valente grounds making a discreet routine check on the safe house Adrian had secured for Bella, just to watch her play in the garden. From a safe distance, a small stolen moment of peace when I was ambushed. They came out of nowhere, masked men moving with terrifying efficiency, their dark forms emerging from the shadows of the hedges. They were Orlov's men, their movements precise and brutal, their faces hidden by black cloth. I tried to fight, kicking and struggling, grabbing at their arms, but I was quickly overpowered, a cloth pressed over my mouth, the sweet chemical smell instantly suffocating me, and the world went dark, pulling me under. When I woke up, the air was cold, damp, and smelled of old Parmesan and expensive wine, the unmistakable scent of the Italian restaurant. I looked around, my head throbbing and my heart seized in terror. I was back in the original Italian restaurant, the place where everything had begun, where I had spoken that cursed word. The chairs were stacked neatly on the tables for the night, and the room was bathed in the harsh, isolating glare of a single powerful spotlight that shone down directly on me. I was forced to kneel, my knees scraping on the cold tile right beside the very table where I had first said "baby the table." Adrian Valente and his men had occupied a perfect echo of my original humiliation. Orloff was standing over me, dressed impeccably, a triumphant, cruel sneer on his face, enjoying his moment of absolute wicked control. In front of him, set up on a tripod, was a camera, its small red light blinking, broadcasting the entire scene live to an exclusive encrypted channel only accessible to the world's major crime families. He was using the birthplace of my humiliation to amplify it one last time, making me the centerpiece of Adrian's downfall, the bait in his final trap. Orloff leaned into the camera, his voice smooth and theatrical, addressing the invisible audience of the criminal underworld, an unseen global crowd of lethal observers. Tonight, he announced the cruelty evident in every syllable, his breath stinking of expensive scotch. We settle a debt with the Lion of Valente. He betrayed the council, he mocked tradition, and he soiled his hands with a girl who is nothing but a street rat. To destroy Valente's heart and his honor, I'll kill the girl who dared call him baby. He grabbed my hair, pulling my head up, so I had to face the blinding light and the camera, and I could see the reflection of the horrifying scene in my own wide, terrified eyes, a kneeling, desperate woman. I knew this was the end. I knew Adrian would come for me, driven by his oath, and I also knew that coming meant walking into a certain lethal trap, sacrificing his life for mine. I closed my eyes, a single hot tear tracking down my cheek, and I whispered the only thing that mattered to me in that moment, the silent plea I hoped Adrian would hear wherever he was, a final, selfless act of love. Don't come for me. Please, Adrian. I don't want to be your weakness. I need you to survive this. Don't trade your life for mine. The silence that followed was broken only by Orloff's manic, echoing laughter, a sound of pure villainy. But then the laughter died, instantly choked off mid-cackle. The main decorative lights of the restaurant, the few that were still on, suddenly flickered and went out, plunging the entire room into near-total darkness, leaving only the harsh spotlight on me and the camera's blinking red eye. I heard a sound, a single, slow, deliberate footstep crunching faintly on something glass, and I knew who it was even before the shadows parted. Adrian Valente walked in alone, utterly unaccompanied, his silhouette imposing in the dim light. He wore a simple black suit, and he looked impossibly dangerous, moving with a cold, terrifying grace, his hands empty but his focus a palpable weapon. He walked straight toward Orloff, his dark eyes fixed on the Russian boss, with an unwavering, deadly focus, completely ignoring the knives and guns of Orloff's guards that instantly materialized from the shadows, their movements betraying their fear. Adrian didn't look at me, didn't acknowledge my presence at all. His entire focus was on Orloff, the man who had tried to break him. The Russian started to speak, a triumphant, arrogant challenge in his voice, but Adrian cut him off, his voice flat and cold, sounding like ice cracking on a winter lake, devoid of all emotion. If you think you can break me with the word baby, you picked the wrong woman. That word is hers now, and it means strength. He reached into his coat and pulled out a phone, a simple black rectangle, and tossed it onto the table between them with a hard thwack. The screen automatically activated, and the whole world, the watchers on the encrypted feed, Orloff, his men, and me saw the shaky, grainy video I had recorded weeks ago. The video of me, the unassuming pet courier, risking my life to expose Lucas to protect Valente's empire, the moment I had delivered the proof that was worth millions, a testament to my quiet courage. The entire Mafia world saw my loyalty not in words or subservience, but in quiet, calculated action. Orloff was momentarily stunned, the video proof undermining his entire narrative of me as Adrian's shallow weakness and distraction. In that moment of pure, blinding distraction, while Adrian's cold eyes were still locked on the Russian, Orloff reacted pure, desperate instinct, taking over, snatching his chance. He pulled his sidearm, training it directly on my kneeling figure, ready to eliminate the symbol of his defeat. "You lose, Valente," he screamed, his voice cracking with rage and fear. I saw the flash of the muzzle, felt the terrible, sickening pressure of the air, rushing past my ear, and then a deafening explosion. But I wasn't hit. Adrian had moved with impossible speed, diving across the small distance, throwing his body in front of me, shielding my body with his own. The bullet found its target in his shoulder, and he grunted a short, sharp sound of pain, his body crumpling over mine, his weight heavy and protective. Everything became a blur, a sudden chaotic explosion of motion and sound. Orlov's men lunged, but they were a fraction of a second too late. Adrian, even with a bullet in his shoulder, had pushed me free of his weight. I scrambled my hand instinctively, closing around the gun that had fallen from Orlov's grasp onto the floor. It was heavy cold, and strangely comforting in my shaking hand, an extension of my own desperate need for survival. I didn't think. I only acted the built-up rage and terror of weeks culminating in that one desperate final move fueled by the sight of Adrian's blood. I raised the weapon, pointing it at the stunned Russian boss, who was just now realizing that he had missed his true target and was vulnerable. The second explosion was louder, final, echoing off the high ceilings of the restaurant, silencing the last of the cruelty. Orlov fell heavily right beside the table where my humiliation had started his blood, mixing with the dry, forgotten chocolate of the tiramisu I had once face-planted into. Adrian was slumped over me, his blood soaking the shoulder of my expensive dress, his breath coming in ragged gasps, his pain evident in the tightness of his face. Orlov's guards momentarily paralyzed by the shocking death of their boss, by my hand scattered in confusion as the heavy doors of the restaurant burst open and Adrian's men, the ones who had silently followed him, poured in. They secured the room, stepping over the fallen body of the Russian boss, but all I could focus on was the man in my arms. His eyes closed, his face pale, his powerful body suddenly fragile. I cradled his head gently, my hands smeared with his life's blood, and a sob finally escaped my chest, raw and uncontrolled, a release of weeks of terror. Then slowly, painfully, Adrian's eyes fluttered open. He looked at me, a faint, almost imperceptible smile touching his lips, his voice barely a whisper against my ear, the same quiet, intimate tone he had used in the wine cellar, cementing the meaning of our journey. "Baby, this time you saved me." The word, which had been a mistake, a curse and a weapon, was now something else entirely, a term of endearment earned in blood and fire, a vow of mutual survival. I leaned my forehead against his, tasting the salt of my tears, and the metallic tang of his blood, and the finality of it all settled over me. We had been through hell, through every kind of scorn and danger, through political traps and public humiliations, and we had come out on the other side, still standing bound forever. I didn't know what the future held for a pet courier and a mafia boss, but I knew we were bound now by something stronger than an oath, stronger than reputation, stronger than fear. We were bound by shared survival. I squeezed my eyes shut, holding him tight, finally completely free of the shame that had followed me for weeks, letting the last of my terror bleed away. I pulled back just enough to look into his eyes, my voice thick with emotion, but firm with my new, hard-won certainty. From now on, I'm calling the right man. I was just Emily Carter, the girl they overlooked, the one who didn't belong, but I held Adrian Valente, the most powerful man in the room, in my arms, the only one he trusted to protect him. I wasn't just his partner under a blood oath. I was the one who had saved his life and destroyed his greatest enemy. I had stared down the enemy and refused to break, refusing to let my past define my present, refusing to be a victim. I learned that you don't need to be loud to have power, and you don't need money to have worth, and that quiet dignity will always cut deeper than shouting. The quiet ones, the ones who watch and listen and carry their dignity through the dirt, they are the ones who ultimately survive the fire. They tried to break me with a word, but that word became my destiny, the anchor that pulled me from the shadows into a life I never could have imagined, forcing the world to finally see me not as trash, but as a queen. Where are you watching from? Leave a comment below and hit follow to walk with me through heartbreak, betrayal, and finally healing.